Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And each week we come at you talking about the world of music and music news.
There's a lot to talk about in this now episode, and I want to kind of keep the pace of it up as quickly as we can. I want to kick off with talking about new album announcements and new singles from artists that we're excited about or that we just have something to say about. And I want to start off with one of the most Jams and Tea core artists, one of the artists that we have devoted the most airtime to talking about, whether it be a full breakdown of their discography in 2020, whether it be the 2 albums they have released since that video, which we've reviewed in exhaustive detail, whether it be my video on this band's 10 greatest songs, which still I think I mostly stand by, although there would definitely be some changes now. One of the bands I spent the most time in my life listening to, probably my favorite working pop band, Everything, who have just announced their 7th album, Mountainhead. It's coming out in March of next year, and it is led with the lead single Cold Reactor, which is an absolute fucking bop. I mean, I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's a fucking gorgeous song. It's like, on the one hand, it's like an it's like a very everything song, like in every respect. The jagged weirdness of John Higgs's lyricism, which is still rooted in really kind of like emotional search for connection. The, sort of angular and weirdly filtered guitar patterns of Alex Robert Shaw, the very steady but propulsive rhythm section of Michael Spearman and Jeremy Pritchard, and just the hazed in synthetic effects atmosphere of all of it. It's very everything. It fits in, I think, a lot with the style of music that they were pursuing on their last album, 2022's Raw Data Feel. And notably, that record was self-produced, and so will this new record be as well. So they're kind of within this period of I think, working really prolifically, working really quickly. We've had really quick turnarounds between records. And so they've been in a real kind of period of creative inspiration, which has been great to see. They've been making some of their best music in the last few years. So while this record feels very much like a continuation of the more spacious but stripped back sound of Raw Data Feel, there's also a kind of neurosis that feels very of a piece with their earlier material as well. It reminds me in shades thematically and sometimes musically of Man Alive and Arc.
It does sound a little bit like the last album, but there is something that's a bit smoother and more organic sounding, particularly in regards to the way the percussion sounds on here. And just Higgs is kind of like rambly. It almost feels like the verse lyrics here he's sort of like tripping over to get finished, but there's a specific rhythm that he delivers it with that makes it really catchy, and then just follows it up with like a distinct like refrain that he ends the lines with, the cold reactor. It's really great. I absolutely agree. I love it. Can't wait to see the direction that this goes in.
Only John Higgs could make a lyric like, "I'm sorry, Satan, but I can't do this evil on my own," feel genuinely emotionally devastating. And just the line, "I love you like an atom bomb, but I've become a cold reactor," is like fantastic. It's
oh God, yeah.
moving the more you interrogate it, but it's also kind of silly. Cold reactor, both in the context of nuclear energy, but also in the context of how we consume information on the internet. We are all kind of cold reactors. It's a song that has a lot of depth to it, as all of Higgs's best work do, but it's also ridiculously fun and weird. And it has these like little processed vocal snippets that are like very reminiscent of R+7 era One O Tricks Point Never, which is a cool little reference point that I was not expecting. Jake, you brought to my attention that none other than Miss Chelsea Wolfe has announced a new record. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and about the singles that have come with that announcement?
Yes, Chelsea Wolfe, longtime viewers of the podcast know, one of my personal favorite working artists. I did a worst to best on her before this podcast was even officially launched, and then rebooted that worst to best just because I have been a fan of her for years and years and years now. And what's curious is that this feels like the first album that she's put out in a really long time. And to some extent, that's both true and untrue, because we, of course, had the 2021 collaboration between her and Converge, Blood Moon, one of my favorite albums that either artist has put out. So, you know, we haven't been starved for content. But the thing is that the album that she did before that, 2019's Birth of Violence, was a very stripped back effort that was very contemplative, mid-placed gothic folk music. That was an area that, you know, she'd explored that before on earlier albums like Apocalypsis, but that one is a little bit more single-minded. So it kind of feels like the last true blue Chelsea Wolfe album was in 2017, and that is His Spun. And even then, that in itself was a pivot hardcore into sludge and doom metal. So it's felt like a long time since we've heard what a traditional Chelsea Wolfe song even sounds like. And I, as a fan of hers, could not be pleased with the 2 singles that she's released thus far for the album. The album is amusingly called She Reaches Out to She Reaches Out to She. The album art and title give me a very like PJ Harvey vibe, which Chelsea Wolfe, that checks. But the 2 singles so far are the opener, Whispers in the Echo Chamber, and Dusk. The songs are fantastic. As Riley pointed out to me, behind the boards, we actually have Dave Seatek as a producer for not just these songs, but for the album overall, who you will probably know from TV on the radio. Everything about these songs sounds great, but what excites me is that both of them not only feel distinct in that it feels like Chelsea's being like, she's steering away from being a little bit more single-minded in terms of her genre approach and is going back to the Abyss, Apocalypsis, Pain is Beauty era, where she's like fusing a bunch of different shit together to the point where some of this sounds like low inflected like slowcore, and some of it sounds like early Nine Inch Nails. And I am so here for all of it. Both of these songs are absolutely terrific. I can't wait to see how they're going to fit into the context of a greater album. Not that Chelsea has needed a return to form, because I think every album that she's made properly is excellent, but I've been waiting for her to give me a little bit more of a taste of those albums that I came to her for in the first place, after like half a decade's worth of kind of playing around and tinkering with a little bit more single-minded sounds, which have been successful in their own right. But I'm super stoked for this. One of my most anticipated albums of 2024 for certain.
Absolutely. And now I want to talk about another heavily anticipated album that's finally arriving, and that is the new album from Danny Brown, Quaranta. We have had this particular record teased for a while. It's been in development hell, and then I think it was in label hell with Warp for a while, but thankfully Danny's finally negotiated a release for the album, which I think was originally supposed to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Triple X, but we're a couple of years out from that now. Anyway, it's finally coming, and the lead single Tantor it's just beautifully ridiculous. The lyrics are hilarious. Danny's energy and flow is completely on point, but the sound of this thing is so detuned, unpleasant, and uncomfortable in a way that feels like it's something between the last 2 albums he did, you know what I'm saying, an Atrocity Exhibition. I'm really excited to see what the record delivers. It's going to be quite a short album. It's only going to be 34 minutes, but really excited for it nonetheless. Some cool collaborations on here, including Bruiser Wolf and Mike, who also, Mike has a album out that came out a few weeks ago that is like glowingly received that I still have to listen to.
Ditto. This is the most I've enjoyed any beat by The Alchemist in some time. Like, the percussion on this song is absolutely fucking nuts. This is so much more colorful than I'm used to him being, and frankly, if this level of game is brought to the entire album, some of the criticisms I've had with Danny's earlier work, like Triple X, is that sometimes it occasionally feels like it runs a little bit long for me. So the idea of him kind of like honing down, getting to the like core essential tracks here and just doing like a 34-minute-ish album is like, yes, absolutely. So hyped. What, we got less than a month until that comes out?
Yeah, that's right. November 17th. Excited to see that Paul White continues to be among the roster of producers on this as well. One of Danny's most pivotal collaborators, very heavily responsible for the sound of his best records. Really excited to see how this comes together with him and Alchemist, and with where Danny's at this point in his career as well, in a very stable and successful place. I'm interested to see how the record reflects that. The last single I want to talk about before we start talking about records and things more broadly is something that, normally I wouldn't bring this up because I feel like we've poo-pooed on this band a lot, and I don't want it to get to the point where we're essentially just repeating ourselves, recycling critiques and mean comments or whatever for a band that a lot of people enjoy. But I do feel obliged to talk about the new single from IDLES. It's called Dancer. Something that's been very surprisingly unpublicized in relation to this is that the song is actually a collaboration with James Murphy and Nancy Wang of LCD Sound System. It is the lead single of their upcoming album, Tang. I'm not sure how that's supposed to be said or what it means. I'm sure there's something there. But the song itself is interesting. So for anyone who doesn't know, and I don't blame you if you don't, because it has honestly been a while since we've talked about IDLES, bit of a love-hate relationship with this band that's kind of curdled into a hate-hate relationship over time, because IDLES to me are like one of the most representative bands of where alternative music in a punk space was at in the late 2010s as well. They're so emblematic of resist era rock music. There's a particular philosophy and tonality to them that's very like bleeding heart liberal, in the sense that it was like very much about progressive sloganeering. And not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but IDLES' particular approach to making punk music with explicitly progressive politics in the context of the current era did often amount to what was very two-dimensional. And again, that's not necessarily inherently a bad thing, but it is something that is inherently limited, I think. And something that IDLES, despite having, I think, quite an intriguing and effective initial breakout with just the punctuality and the brusqueness of what they were doing, their style of sloganeering kind of hit a wall really quickly, and unfortunately resulted in, of all the albums we've reviewed, probably one of the most negative that reviews we've ever given, which was 2020's Ultra Mono, which unfortunately was the apotheosis of the vapidity that IDLES seem to lean further and further into, as their political philosophy just
fuck you, I'm a lover,
became increasingly more grating and ineffectual, and also came, whether their fault or not, to feel like it was emblematic of an increasing trend in progressive politics, or in liberal politics specifically, which is the trend of posturing, the trend of speaking to, of saying all the right words, but not doing anything beyond the most shallow of things. And that's something that increasingly, as the years have gone on and up until the current moment, there's less and less space and less patience for that kind of shallowness in pop culture. It's something that people in general have more and more reacted against, where they didn't in the late 2010s, where you could be as shallow or as simplistic or as sloganeering as you wanted, and that was just what people needed at that point in time. But more and more, I think IDLES are in a weird place of feeling like they're less and less fitting with the current cultural moment in terms of how we treat politics. Everything political, and particularly in terms of progressive politics, is very serious, and nuance is important. These sorts of topics are treated very differently, I think, than they were 5 or 6 years ago.
Difficult to clear a space for IDLES in a world that's very much open to embracing bands like Soul Glow,
But to IDLES' credit, I feel as though they have realized that, because with their last album, Crawler, And if this new single is an indication, I think with this album as well, they seem to be pivoting away from this sort of broad commentary on, kind of external socio-political forces, more towards something interior. And that was the defining aspect of Crawler, I think, was that it was like the opposite of Ultra Mono in terms of like its style and approach lyrically and thematically. Like Ultra Mono is a very political, socio-cultural album and its orientation, whereas Crawler was insular. Joe Talbot was writing songs about himself and his life and his struggles, and they weren't necessarily hugely contextualized by anything grander or greater. That was a smart move. Unfortunately, the album is boring as all shit. It was a really asinine and uninspiring album musically, and it felt like a lot of the grit and aggression that made IDLES so striking from the get-go has kind of been sanded off. Now with this new song and this new album rollout, it feels as though IDLES are kind of trying to lean into a slightly more dance punky direction with their sound, which actually, honestly, on paper, I mean, certainly with collaborating with LCD Sound System is a very smart thing to do if you're pivoting in that direction.
Oh yeah.
On paper, that feels very smart for them because it feels like a way that they can channel how good they are at really sort of angular, booming, simplistic aggression and noise. It feels like that's a really smart way to kind of channel what they're good at musically, which is the very sort of two-dimensional thing, into something that can have a real sort of pulse and liveliness to it that the last record lacked. Unfortunately, once again, while I think that they more or less do achieve that with the groove to this song, once again, I'm left in this place of just being really irritated. It's so weird, like what this band are trying to do with this, I approve of, but I listen to it and I just get annoyed. And I think it's Joe Talbot to a certain degree. I still can't get on board with him, the way that he performs, the way that he sings, the way that he kind of like lands on particular phrases or sounds and just kind of beats them into the ground. So to speak. He does that all throughout the song. And it's just like, it's sandpaper to me. And this is the most frustrated I've felt with IDLES in a while, because I feel like the potential for them to evolve into a band that I can get back on the side of again is just completely at odds with the irritating personality that it exudes that I just can't get on board with at all. This whole like thing that the song seems to be going for about like, the power of human physical movement, the importance of dancing as a way of kind of like releasing, euphoria and all that kind of thing. For a band that feel like they're trying so hard to channel a kind of primal release of energy that allows you to experience catharsis, the worst thing you can do is sound so rote and stale and lifeless in the process of doing that. It's just a song that feels completely musically at odds with what it's trying to do philosophically. And I think that's a real shame, because there's a lot of potential, I think, for IDLES to dig themselves out of the really kind of regressive place that they've ended up. And I just don't see it yet. And I want to see it. And then there's this fucking press release that they put out at the same time as the release of the single about like kind of what the album's going to be thematically, about needing love. I needed love, so I made it. I gave love out to the world and it feels like magic. This is our album of gratitude and power. All love songs, all is love. Like, what it seems to me that IDLES are now is the same kind of bluntly meaningless band that they've always been, like just sort of grunts and groans and words and noises and gestures towards some kind of idea of a personal life philosophy that just feels vapid and empty. I mean, this press release sounds like a fucking DJ Khaled skit. IDLES are just never going to be for me again. And it's a real shame.
Yeah.
I wish that I got it with IDLES. I wish I did, because obviously they're a band that do a lot for a lot of people, but to me, their music is so shallow and so asinine and so annoying and so representative of all of the qualities that I find the most irritating in people. And I just can't get past that. And I think maybe the reason I get hung up on it is that they're so well-meaning, and it would be maybe easier to just kind of not care at all if they weren't so well-meaning. I really tried to like this new IDLES song this week. I really did. And it just made me feel further disenfranchised from this incredibly popular rock band. I want to dig now. I want to step away from pop music now and dig back into the world of very online artists that we tried to champion, and that we've talked a lot about across the year, this year in particular, I feel like, and the increasing trend of a particular brand of emo-tinged shoegaze that's become increasingly popular, increasingly diversified, and increasingly present in the online music space as well. I've talked about a number of artists, obviously the Longinus recordings artists like Paranol and Asian Glow and Sonhos Tumam Konta, but there's an increasing presence of these artists from a broader array of places, many of whom are LGBTQ, particularly transgender as well. There's a lot of transgender artists that we've championed this year that have emerged and have increasingly released uncompromising works that push this particular sound forward. And one of those artists, I think, is Jane Remover, who is very young, only 20 years old. I celebrated their album Frailty. I think it was an album that I shouted out in our most overlooked albums of 2021 video. I think that album is still incredible. It's a very distorted but hyped and an energetic, digitized chaos, rambunctious shoegaze emo album that was one of the most unique records of that year. And in a weird way, even feels kind of ahead of its time, despite only being 2 years ago. I was a huge fan of that album. And that was also an album that was made for Jane pre-public transition as well. So once Jane had rebranded and had kind of presented themselves in this new light, released a fantastic song called Royal Blue Walls, which is not on this album, but was one of my favorite songs of last year as well. I'm really excited for Jane to kind of follow up Frailty, and specifically as well, knowing that she would be releasing some kind of statement with her next record as well, especially with it being the first album under the Jane Remover name. And now we finally have that record. It's called Census Designated. It is a sweeping, massive sounding record, but it is massive in the pursuit of a particularly brooding, dark, elegiac, noisy, bass-heavy miasma. It's a record that, I should say, for anyone who hasn't heard Jane before, is starkly different from her previous work. I mean, Frailty is a record that pops and has a lot of hard edges and a lot of kind of, post-black dresses, sort of digitized chaos fused with emo. Whereas this is an opus of oceanic swelling walls of sound. It's a record it's so enveloping. It's one of those albums that there's a relatively more normal and compact sounding album in here, but it's kind of been warped and stretched and just suffused in this thickening black darkness. It's a intense album in that respect to consume just aesthetically, right? It's demanding because it's so atmospherically heavy and so thick that you can't really, ironically, for a record that is atmospheric as it is, you can't really listen to it passively. You kind of have to let it sort of take you over. And Jane is so buried inside of this album. Her voice is so suffused in these thick walls of post-rocky shoegaze distortion that it feels very much like the sound of someone completely consumed in a miasma as they attempt to kind of seek their identity and carve themselves out. All the reference points that I thought of while listening to this I did think of Paranormal in some respects. I thought of that whole wave of digitized shoegaze. I also thought of Ethel Cain, but it's kind of like it's a weird funhouse mirror Ethel Cain, whereas Ethel Cain's influences are very much in Americana and a very kind of classical style of pop songwriting and performance that often gets associated with artists like Lana Del Rey and their broader influences from 20th century music. There's like a kind of a thematic and emotional connection between these two artists, but Jane Remover is like if that world was kind of channeled through a completely different set of influences that are very online, that are very kind of digital, that are very glitch and noise and post rock.
Less Springsteen and more My Bloody Valentine, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way of putting it. So my biggest way of kind of presenting this was to kind of say that it's in the same world as those artists, but also sounds completely different to them. The other reference point I thought of while listening to it a second time was, weirdly enough, the world of cloud rap and online trap, specifically the Drain Gang collective of artists, in particular Echo 2K, who I think Jane shares a lot of vocal similarities with, except this record bears no sonic resemblance to cloud rap or trap at all. It's just a kind of shared spiritual similarity. There's also a particular wave of online artists who I think are the biggest point of comparison here, that being artists like Brackens and Quadika and Quanic. This particular like sort of subdued emo that's kind of wrested from this fuzz of digital hell. But buried within all of the mire of this album is some incredibly powerful music, I think. It's not a record that I connect with as much as Frailty, but I think that's just because it is by design a lot less immediate than that record. There's some really emotional performances here, and there's some hypnotic and gloriously beautiful musical soundscapes. I think that if you're looking for hard and fast song structures, and if you're looking for rigidity and clarity, the record may leave you very cold. But if you are in a particularly shitty mood, honestly, if you're kind of in the muck and you want to just wallow, I don't know if there's a better album that's come out this year for that specific space in particular of wallowing. While it is ponderous and overlong, to be sure, it's also kind of those things in the pursuit of the fullness of its sound. It's the kind of thing where this sort of wallowing landscape wouldn't work if it was like significantly shorter, because as soon as you were kind of settled into that space, it would be over. And it helps, I think, that the record increases in the presence of what could be called hooks or, sort of memorable vocal lines as it goes along. The final stretch of songs, in particular, the title track and Video, which is my favorite song on the record, where I think that the singer-songwriter reference points like Ethel Cain, I think, come through more strongly. It's weird to call it a triumph for Jane because it's so difficult and dark, but I also think that, again, coming off of the back of a record like Frailty, which is again quite different to this, I respect the boldness of it. I mean, Jake, what are your thoughts on this? Having me just kind of thrown it to you and said, like, I want to hear what you think of this.
I think the thing I would agree with the most is just the boldness of the record. To me, that's what's so startling about it, because it's so heavy, it's so dense, and in many respects so artistically confident in what it wants to be. In many ways, this feels like it's coming from an artist that I should have gotten into sooner. And I have yet to hear Frailty, and frankly, after hearing this, I am far more interested in seeing what that record is like in comparison to this, just because there's clearly a lot of talent on display here. I think that as a lyricist, Jane is often blunt, starkly very emotional, quite evocative in several songs on here. Its best moments being the song Fling, as well as Census designated, the title track, which are the moments at which I think all of the most successful elements of the album sort of coalesce into these songs that you're just kind of wading through this distortion and these post-rocky structures and then building to these climaxes that are just positively incandescent, frankly. Like, these are some of the loudest and most aggro things that I've heard this year. Like, it's sort of like the Parannoul album, but it's a little bit less polished. The point for comparison I would actually use is the Sonhos Tomam Kanta album from last year, which I was an enormous fan of, one of my favorite albums of that year, and really of the decade so far. And I think that every year, people like us who listen to a lot of records, they have one or two albums that you just don't connect with it for whatever reason. And this is without a doubt the case with me with this record, in that I recommend this to everyone who is interested in shoegaze, in post-rock, in emo, and all of the things that we typically advocate for. This is absolutely something you should check out because it is clearly thoughtfully made and people are clearly connecting with it. And the reason that I don't is in that a lot of these song structures for me, they are quite unsatisfying. These songs will wade in their own atmosphere for long periods of time, and then they will build to those sort of crescendos that I mentioned. And oftentimes those moments are fantastic. And they are also by far the most I am engaged in those songs. And they are typically about 30 seconds to 1 minute of a given song. And all of these songs are about 5 to 6 minutes long. And for the rest of those 4 minutes, these songs just sort of gestate in first gear, to the point where this is a very impenetrable record. If you want to get into the lyricism, it might be a little bit difficult for you because of how buried Jane's vocals are within these songs and within these mixes. It's a very, like, you have to really mine the elements of this that you want to get out of. And like, I completely understand like getting a lot out of it, and again, like, listening to it when you're in a particularly shitty mood really does help. But I found myself at a considerable distance with this just because it manages to execute all of its ideas in ways that, largely speaking, try my patience, even though each individual song on here, for the most part, is pretty solid. Like, I don't really think that there are any bad or even outright mediocre songs on here, save for the second song, Lips, on here, which I think is maybe the most egregious case of a song that just really refuses to get out of first gear. Just like, really, just like, if you aren't into the first 2 minutes of that song, you're probably not going to be into the rest of it. So I found it quite difficult and quite challenging. I at least found it an interesting musical exercise in trying to discover what it was about this that I didn't immediately latch onto, that I like do everything else musically. So I found it valuable in that respect, but just not really an album I can say is for me.
All right, now I want to talk about this new album from the Menzingers, one of the most celebrated jams and tea core bands. Myself, Morgan, and friend of the podcast, Connor, did a fantastic video on their entire discography last year. Still really proud of that one, especially because it's one of those examples of a video that we've done that really like helped me to fully unlock the band and fully realize my appreciation for them, as well as also to fully realize that After the Party is the masterpiece that it is. So yeah, go and check out that video if you haven't already, or if you're interested, of course. But the Menzingers are back with the follow-up to 2019's Hello Exile. Their new album, some of it was true, which is a great title, like a very Menzingers title. It's a welcome record for the band. I mean, it's been a while since Hello Exile. Actually, you know what's funny to me is that the age of that album is basically the same as the age of my friendship with you two as well. So, because that record came out right around that time. It's been long enough, and we're finally graced with a new album from the Menzingers. I think it's fitting to throw over to the most Menzingers pilled of all of us, Morgan. I know that this is a band that are very near and dear to your heart. What were your hopes ahead of Some of It Was True, and how do you feel about the record now that you've had a while to digest it?
With bands like this, I've found it important to manage expectations. and I've gotten pretty good at it, thankfully. Naturally, I was excited for this record and all of the singles, especially the one released about a week or so before the album itself, called Try, absolutely flattened me. At this current moment, a top three song of the year for me.
My favorite song on the record too.
I think Tom May's best work fronting this band and writing for it in ages. Not to discredit anything else he's done, because just such a wealth of stuff that I love from him. But I mean, I think this is a real shining moment for his songwriting tenure in general. As I was hinting at, the album didn't let me down, but I have more reservations about it in comparison to all but the debut album from them. I think it's another really strong outing for the band. I think, in particular, this may be the strongest they've sounded sonically. It's expansive where it needs to be, and really compact and energetic and punchy where it needs to be. Producer Brad Cook and engineer Paul Voren, whose names I don't recognize, but I don't want their work on
Oh,
this album to go unsung. As strong as I do think the record is, it's a little wheel spinny, which was something that Hello Exile was sort of in danger of doing in moments as well. I think it would be interesting for the band to, if not change up their sound, because it's a punk band and that's not really what they're known for, but to explore different avenues in terms of the things that they're writing about. But that said, this is just another album of this incredible band doing some of the things that they do better than anyone else, basically. And it is a rousing success in my mind because of that.
mhm. Brad Cook,
Yeah.
just to build on the mention, who I agree does a fantastic job producing this record. He's kind of like a broader indie rock polymath. He's been involved with bands like The War on Drugs and Bon Iver, and he's produced breakout records for artists like Indigo D'Souza and Snail Mail. But yeah, just to kind of echo in on this record, I really enjoy this album. I think that after Hello Exile, which felt like a little bit of coming off the back of, well, my perspective is Hello Exile came off the back of what I consider to be their masterpiece, After the Party. And it was kind of a record that situated the band in a strange position of navigating what exactly their identity was going to be as they age into the kind of people that they spent their entire career singing about being terrified becoming. And that's kind of been, I touched on this in the Menzingers video that we did. That's kind of been the perennial narrative of the Menzingers, at least since Rented World, has been this kind of like trying to reconcile the inexorable like onward march of age with this kind of like faded nostalgia that they're clinging to, and the way that that dissonance gets more and more marked with every record because they're getting older and older. And with Hello Exile, it was kind of like a thing where it was sort of like, this shtick is starting to feel a bit not bad or necessarily, but just kind of weird. And you kind of wish for them to figure out a new vision or version for what they're going to be. And interestingly enough, some of it was true, doesn't really succeed in doing that. It still feels like the Menzingers are kind of stuck in time in the same way they have been for a while. But weirdly, it's just slightly less of an issue for me than it was with Hello Exile. And I think that's because with this record, the Menzos sound a little bit more confident and just sort of accepting the place that they're at and accepting that this is our shtick. We basically write the same songs or the same 2 and 3 songs over and over again, but we do it with heart and we do it with commitment, and we do it because we know and accept that it's what we're good at, and we don't want to necessarily push outside that envelope in any way. And that's what this record is. It's the Menzingers quite comfortably and confidently asserting, we know what we're good at, and we're just going to stick to that for now. And if that sounds like I'm damning with faint praise, or if I'm like being condescending, I genuinely do not mean it to be. There's a lot of bands, I think, who achieve success early on and then go through this period of wondering, what the hell do we do with ourselves? How do we evolve? Their records can end up suffering because of that sense of self-aware anxiety that pervades that what do we do? How do we sound like we're maturing? How do we evolve? And the greatest compliment I can give, some of it was true, is that it doesn't feel like it's racked with those anxieties at all. It feels very assured. in the fact that it's like, this is us doing what we do, and we're not fucking with the formula even remotely. I want to echo the sentiments about Try, which I think is the best song on here. I've listened to that so many times. Incredible. And it's very nice and gratifying that it comes from Tom as well, because his songs sort of sit in the shadow of Greg's. And I do think that is unfortunately an issue with the other 3 songs that he leads on this record. I like Nobody Stays, actually. I think that song's quite good.
I love that song.
Yeah, I love that song.
But Love at the End and High Low, I could have done without those ones, and I don't want to be mean, but they were probably my 2 least favorites on the record. I only say that because Try is my favorite. So, you win some, you lose some. And also just Greg Barnett's voice is the sound of the Menzingers to me. Like, obviously there's the barroom rock, aesthetic, and there's all the sort of heartlandy stuff that they've done, and all the musical stuff is very Menzo's, true to that on this record. But what will always make or break the Menzingers record for me is Greg Barnett. And as long as he's on here singing the way that he does, putting that stank into his voice, sounding like he's about to cry in basically every song he sings, but also never wavering in his performances, that's all I need. And that's here in spades.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to, not to derail you at all, but it's interesting the ways that I find myself thinking, I do want this band to evolve some, but like with stipulations, so long as there's like a Come On Heartache on every album or something like that, because I need something like that always.
Yeah. You want to see them, like, I guess maybe where I'm at is if I were to outright state what I want this band to do, is I kind of maybe want them to get a little bit more grandiose in their scope. And I'm thinking a little bit like latter era Killers, for instance. But then when I think about that, I start to wonder if I'm just wanting them to be a different band, and I get in my head about it, and then I put the record on and I just forget about all that stuff. The other songs besides Try that really stand out to me as some of the best songs this band have written in a while are Ultraviolet and Alone in Dublin.
Great song.
And I'll also throw in Running in the War of the Wind as well. Those 3 songs are big highlights for me. I just especially want to shout out Alone in Dublin, purely because I have been singing that she knows my heart, she knows how to start it, she knows my heart, she knows how to start it. Like, that has been in my head just for hours over the course of the last couple of weeks. I've just been like internally singing that. I love the vocal performance in that song. I love just the raw emotion, the way he sings. I've wasted the worst, I've wasted away. That's a great song. Ultraviolet just feels like classic Menzo's. It's a really, really strong tune. And Running in the Roar of the Wind is a beautiful end to the record. So I'm going to start talking in circles. It's a solid Menzingers record. It benefits greatly from, if I don't think it's a million light years ahead in necessarily quality than the last album, I think it's better because of the confidence and assuredness that it has, that record didn't always have. Jake, your thoughts?
Think that this album is basically a great litmus test of where the floor of the Menzingers is for any given person. Not to say that this is an album that like bottoms them out or anything. I just think that the escalating order of affinity for this record is certainly Ryley, myself, Morgan, and I feel like that directly correlates to how much each of us kind of love this band. I have my minor gripes with Hello Exile, but as someone who's like way more fond of that album than most people, I think that a lot of the identity of that record is kind of found in how unassured it is. And that is its own form of refreshing when listening to it, just because it's like Ryley mentioned, the arc of the Menzingers is being in your 20s and then writing songs for 10 years about how you're afraid to be in your 30s. And then Hello Exile is kind of the culmination point of being like, to me, that's the most bittersweet Menzo's album, because it's, we're here, what the fuck now? And so really I was more concerned for this album than anything, because I was just like, all right, now what are we gonna do? And the answer is steadfastly a little bit more of the same. But I do feel like there are like 1 or 2 things that do make this record stand out a bit. One being just the emphasis of the heartland rock. I don't really feel like it's ever been stronger than it is here. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the cover of the record is directly invoking Springsteen's Nebraska. Not done without intention. This still sounds like a Menzingers album, but it definitely does feel like they are attempting to push the boundaries. It's not like a full-fledged commitment, and frankly, I kind of think it would be a lot better if it was. I would probably get along with it a little bit more. But as it stands, I can't really be upset, especially when the first half of this is like as airtight as it is. Hope is a dangerous little thing, and there's no place in the world for me, like back to back to start this thing off. Oh, what a phenomenal way to kickstart this record. This is like the perfect anthemic, put this on in your stereo, fucking hit the top of your car. Like the stuff this band is made for, a premier car album, IMO. And I mean, again, Nobody Stays, the title track, Try, Come on Heartache, Ultraviolet. All of these songs are heavy hitters. Like, they may not be tip top tier Menzinger songs for me, but the best of these come close. I do think the album's a little bit lopsided on the other hand. Like, I think the front half is maybe not significantly stronger than the back half, but like its hit rate is, I think, is just undeniably a little bit better. Like, aforementioned, Take It to Heart. I'm also not like really that big into Take It to Heart and Love at the End. Like the back to back just feels a bit like
Well,
maybe it's just
my issue with Take It to Heart is that it's got a really cool riff and it does nothing with it. It just kind of happens.
That's exactly what I was getting at, is that these songs, they kind of shift like into first gear and then never really get past that. A lot of the song structures in the back half to me feel just a little bit undercooked. A little bit of the gas is let off the pedal at this point, and they don't have the same kind of strength or emphasis as some of the other stuff. I do like Alone in Dublin, High Low, and I Didn't Miss You a little bit more than those songs, but they still aren't quite on the level of anything that first half. But I do think Running in the Roar of a Wind is a great way to close the album out. It's really that, like, yeah, this is the Menzingers doing what they've always done. But to me, the reason I would put this, generally speaking, in the bottom half of my Menzingers ranking is just because it's the only Menzingers album of like the straight canonical ones of, Chamberlain Waits onwards that I think is like really uneven. Like, that's one of the great things about this band, is that normally I think that their hit rate, their consistency is just super duper on point, no matter if they're making 32-minute long record or a 50-minute long record. They know how to pace a record. Here, on the other hand, it's a little bit uneven for my liking. But that said, they're still the Menzingers, and there's the standard to which I hold them to is particularly high, and they are still meeting that standard at the end of the day.
I want to shout out a few albums that have celebrated notable anniversaries recently. I'll run through a few very quickly, and then there's one I just want to kind of zero in on. But a few albums that have turned 20 recently, great records that are very significant, mostly in the world of indie rock, include Death Cab for Cutie's Transatlanticism, which myself and Connor gestured towards when we talked about the 20th anniversary of the Postal Service's Give Up earlier this year in a great video. But Transatlanticism turning 20 sparked a lot of discussion of the legacy of that record, and a lot of people posting Death Cab for Cutie album rankings. Really cool to see how well that record has aged, but also how much love and affinity there still is for Death Cab 20 years on. Great fucking album. We saw the 20th anniversary of Belle and Sebastian's record Dear Catastrophe Waitress, which is one of their best records. We saw the 20th anniversary of indie pop masterclass, the Shins' second album, Shoots Too Narrow, which is a record it's a very important part of my teenage years, but that if you struggle with brightly colored twee indie pop, you might find completely insufferable. It's certainly a record that feels super of its time now, but I think that record really holds up. St. Simon's an incredible song. We also saw this 20th anniversary of the Unicorns soul record, Who Will Cut Our Hair When We're Gone, which I know is an album that you like very much, Jake. That would be a record that might be fun to discuss at some point in the future. Actually, I think that might make a really good club someday.
Yeah, that's an album where it's like every song is so like audacious and full of personality that even now it feels like a breath of fresh air because there's just no shortage of things to talk about. It's also like a like stealthily, insanely influential album.
Yeah, that's a record that influenced a lot of bands that I love, like particularly a band like Los Campesinos, for instance. I think owe a lot to the Unicorns, a lot of the twee pop bands that came across in the 2000s. You know, that record was a genesis for a lot of the more boisterous and, you know, geeky aspects of indie rock and indie folk in the 2000s. So big ups.
Tough Ghost Eternal Banger.
But the album I want to talk about that's celebrating anniversary the week that we record this, where I think this anniversary is the most significant, is an album that's actually turning 10, not 20. And that's Sky Ferreira's, to this day, still solo album, Nighttime, My Time.
Where is it, Sky? Where is
Well,
the sophomore album?
this is the thing. The shadow of this album, but also the shadow of the album that is not, that being her long teased Masochism, which, you know, we've had songs from Sky Ferreira in recent years, you know, the most notable of which was Downhill Lullaby, which I think came out in 2019 or 2018. It was a long time ago now. When that dropped, that felt like it was a big moment because Sky had already in 2018, you know, around the time of the 5th anniversary of Nighttime, My Time, you know, even at that point, she had been teasing masochism for several years. And it was like, okay. And she was promising there was a big profile that came out on her when Downhill Lullaby dropped. And there was a lot of hype around that song as well. I really enjoyed it. It continued the kind of dark, sort of dingy, wallowing sound that Nighttime, My Time offers in some of its eerier moments. But it was so well produced and so slick and so exciting. I listened to that song a lot when it came out. And then there was nothing. We got another song, Don't Forget, in 2022, which is a great synth pop song that felt like, you know, is this going to be the start of the masochism rollout? And there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion of why it is that we don't have masochism. Sky, of course, has been one of many victims of label-related dramas in terms of wresting creative freedom that she's been unable to fully gain. But there's a whole like litany of reasons why we don't have masochism, and you know, for a large amount of them we don't really know how much truth there is to it, so there's not much point in dwelling in it. It's just that now that we're 10 years out from Nighttime, My Time, it feels especially painful that we don't have that record yet. But the album itself, Nighttime, My Time, which, you know, interestingly enough, in retrospect, you know, it feels like one of the most significant albums of 2013, certainly one of the most significant pop records of that year, but it was actually like quite divisive when it came out. There was some critics that hoisted it up as a great step forward for an artist who showed a lot of promise, but hadn't really fully delivered up until this point. And then there were other people who felt, and other critics and publications who felt that it was Sky completely letting go of all of her potential and just releasing a really unfinished sounding, weird and quirky album that just didn't really capitalize on her strengths. It was really interesting to see how divisive that album was. And it is interesting to me to see, and maybe part of it is due to the fact that it hasn't been followed up. But this album, I think, has acquired a certain level of cachet and level of adoration over the years that it didn't necessarily get when it initially came out. I see this even in myself, because when I first encountered this album around the time that it came out, I thought that it was like, you know, half of it was great and the other half of it was kind of bafflingly boring. And over the years, I've come to be more and more a fan of this record, more and more on the side of what Sky is doing here. Even if I still think it is an inconsistent album, its inconsistency and its weirdness and the parts of it that feel like they're deliberately trying to poke a massive hole in her potential and push against the commercialization of Sky that, you know, had been an increasing part of her image in the period before this album. You know, there's a weird place that this record exists in where you have songs like Boys, and you have songs like 24 Hours, and you have songs like You're Not the One, and of course the non-album single Everything Is Embarrassing, which I've talked about before on previous Now episodes of the show. I think is one of the greatest songs of, certainly one of the greatest songs of the 2010s. I would say one of the greatest songs of the century so far. That song is incredible. So you have songs like that are, beautiful and nostalgic and emotional and hard hitting and catchy. And then you also have songs like Ain't You Right and Nobody Asked Me If I Was Okay and A Manco and Heavy Metal Heart and I Will, that are brooding and dissonant and have weird chord choices and weird lack of resolution and grimy and production wise sound very like deliberately obfuscated. And the result is an album that is just bizarrely inconsistent but continuously compelling to me. I think Nighttime My Time is a very singular album that holds up very well, in part because of how baffling and confusing it is. But I also think that aside from the inconsistency of the sound, the general tendency of this record towards a kind of brooding and depressive approach to solo female pop music is very ahead of its time and very influential on a large number of artists. I think, when we've discussed Billie Eilish in the past, she's been associated with a litany of influences in 2010s pop music, but I seldom see Sky Ferreira listed among them, yet to me, she feels like a particularly key reference point for, not just Billie Eilish, but any number of the solo female pop artists and indie artists who've, become so populous in the last, half decade. A lot of them, I feel like, exist in the shadow of this particular record and what Sky did with her image on this album as well. Because before this record, Sky was this kind of like, famous for being a model who was pursuing a music career, projecting this, real kind of shallowness. There were occasionally good songs that came along with that, but she seemed to be in a weird position of being hyped as an artist with a lot of potential, but also being regarded as quite shallow through a fairly misogynistic lens. And so this record was, right down to its Gaspar Noé shot album cover, which is very confronting and dark, and takes this idea of Sky as someone who'd been objectified and treated as a kind of shallow, woman who's essentially kind of parading herself and going on her looks essentially to kind of try and create a career, inverting that by presenting herself naked in the most unflattering light possible. It's a really striking album cover. I think one of the best covers of the decade in terms of what it does for Sky and what it represents and how strong of a statement it is. So yeah, I think there's a lot about this album that continues to fascinate me, that continues to be really striking and really engaging. And it is also just a record that, with the co-signs and production of Ariel Rechtshaid in particular, one of the biggest indie pop producers of the 2010s, most known for his work with Vampire Weekend in that era, but who's gone on to work with, basically all the biggest solo female pop artists in some capacity, especially peripheral to the world of indie. The sound of it, the vision of it, the hooks, the distinctive artistic identity of it all is just a masterclass. Last thing I want us to talk about is one of the biggest film events of the year, Martin Scorsese's new film, Killers of the Flower Moon. It is another in a long line of late period epics for a filmmaker who's generally regarded as one of the greatest American filmmakers of all time, certainly one of the greatest living American filmmakers, if not the greatest. His late period works, films such as Silence, The Irishman, and now this, have been deeply concerned with mortality and legacy, the way that we treat each other. Jake, what are your thoughts on this new Scorsese film and how it lives up to the hype?
Well, this is a podcast full of film nerds, so naturally we are fans of one Mr. Martin Scorsese. Big fans, in fact. I don't know if there is an American filmmaker who I certainly like maybe half of a handful of directors a little bit more than Marty, but there's nobody who's more important to the landscape of cinema. And frankly, nobody's got as amazing of a hit rate as he does. So of course we're going to pay attention, but there's, more of an extra emphasis on why one might be interested in a movie like this, because of its preoccupations with the sort of events that the book that this is originally based on tells, which has to do with the Osage tribe of Native Americans who kind of held sway over large plots of land in places like Oklahoma in the United States, and how they were ultimately colonized by the United States and then kind of overrun. And this is sort of a macro portrait of what that landscape was like. It is the story of a people as much as it is the story of a given person. That, of course, being played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who's the lead in the film, Ernest Burkhart, who we see kind of come back from war, and he and members of his family are sort of the pillars of this community, but we can see that there's already a kind of decay and rot in the state of the union, so to speak. And this is just as titanic and as colossal as his last film, The Irishman, which, if I can at least speak for my podcast mates, I'm pretty sure that that's a universal winner for all of us. The Irishman is one of his absolute best movies, a huge 3-hour monster of a movie that I've still seen multiple times just because it's an incredible movie. Also a deeply melancholic and meditative one that sort of plays against type for Marty. He's a filmmaker who is traditionally relied upon to have these very, distinct rhythms and musicality that his movies tend to abide by. And in this latter sort of portion of his career, he seems to be breaking away with that. We saw that with films like Silence. We saw that with films like The Irishman. And that does carry over to Killers of the Flower Moon, which honestly contains maybe the least momentum of all of these movies. I think that even The Irishman is a movie that in its front half is still it's aimed like a bullet. The front half of that movie is like the front half of Goodfellas. It's just go, 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 go. Whereas this movie is way more methodical in how it doles out information to you and these character beats that go along. In that respect, I could see maybe finding this aspect of it a little bit challenging. But as somebody who really likes when Marty explores more contemplative places, I found this to be absolutely enrapturing, and all across the board technical work on this, set design, cinematography, music by the late great Robbie Robertson, all of which are fantastic. But to me, the standout is the often praised when talking about this movie, Lily Gladstone, who, if she doesn't get Best Actress, a lot of people on Twitter are going to be very mad, and I will be one of those people because she is absolutely deserving of phenomenal lead performance here. I think that the movie hinges on her performance. There's a line at the very, very start of the movie between De Niro and DiCaprio where De Niro's character is describing the Osage people and says that, just because they don't talk a lot doesn't mean that they don't know what's happening. And that's the entire thesis for Lily Gladstone's character in this, who plays Molly Burkhart. And Marty takes some extra steps in his viewpoint here to highlight specifically the preservation of the culture of the Osage people, and makes, in my opinion, one of his grandest and most moving statements with something like the final shot of this movie, which is this sort of enduring emblem of these people who were, exploited and killed and just generally not cared about by the United States government. And that's shown throughout the course of the narrative. And then sort of flashing forward very, very briefly in the movie's final moments to show this sort of modern, resplendent example of Osage culture, which I think is deeply embedded into the core of this movie. There's obviously going to be limitations with the way that Marty, a white man, is going to be able to play into the authenticity of the situation. It's decidedly from a perspective that he can relate more to in the form of Ernest. But I feel like that's something that the movie takes advantage of and still doesn't sacrifice anything else, the silencing of other voices for, taking that center stage. Another aspect of the movie that I think is key to discuss, at least on a music podcast, is the fact that we have 3 prominent musicians appearing in this movie, other than the fact that we have Robbie Robertson of the band doing his final score for the movie, which is excellent, of course. But we have Jack White of the White Stripes, we have Sturgill Simpson, and we have Jason Isbell in this movie. And we had known about this for a while now because they'd been a part of the cast list, had been publicized that they were in the movie. And naturally, we are big fans of Jason Isbell, huge proponents of his music. Weather Vanes, I'm still pretty certain, is Ryley's album of the year, and it's really, really far up there with Morgan and I. Expect to see that album again soon, come end of the year list time. But what was so awesome is seeing that particularly Jason and Sturgill have pretty pronounced roles in the movie, specifically Jason, who gets some really great moments. There's a scene between him and DiCaprio that I think is one of the movie's most darkly comedic moments, where they sort of like square off in an intimidating like stare down. And just the way that Jason is like, he's very much playing just a guy. And, you know, DiCaprio's putting on the sort of movie star character swagger, and you have him just sort of like laying it on thick performance-wise. And Jason, who plays it a little bit more subtly, is just so dry in comparison that it makes for really interesting chemistry whenever he's on screen. He does a fantastic job. Sturgill is less prominent, but still has a very strong personality whenever he does show up. Very funny dude. I don't know. It's interesting to see how prominent of a role music plays in this movie, that I feel like a lot of people would describe for Marty as distinctly less musical than a lot of other movies that he's made. But that was something that was really nice to see. It's a totemic, absolutely monumental movie that's going to be one of those late career masterpieces that Marty's going to be remembered for.
I haven't seen a lot of films that have come out this year, but I feel like I've seen enough to say that this is my favorite film of the year. There's a few, quite a few I'm going to catch up on before I do a year-end list, obviously. But
Same, yeah.
But there's a lot that can be said about this. You've done a really good job of recapping a lot of the core threads of the dialogue around the main parts of this movie, the things that have been talked about, and the things that are most relevant to us. You've done a great job of talking about and highlighting the relevant musicians involved, obviously with a core connection to Jams and Tea and what we do. I echo all of it. I would really the only thing I have to add to what you said is just to echo the comments about Robbie Robertson's score, which is very brooding and very dark and very kind of prominent in the film as a kind of constant, eerie, tense heartbeat that just propagates throughout the movie. A really significant final work for Robbie as well, who grew up in a Native American environment as well, and who, you know, very much came home in a certain sense with the score just before passing. The biggest thing I want to say about Killers of the Flower Moon, I suppose, is to emphasize the interesting things that the movie does with metafiction, and metafiction as a vehicle for communicating some of the movie's core ideas. One of which is the sheer scale of the horror of what it's about and of the events contained within. There's a numbing effect to the mundanity of the evil in this movie, the way in which murder is presented, but also in particular the dynamic between DiCaprio and Gladstone, and the way that the evil of what he does is so every day. It is something, it's poisoning her slowly. It is murder that is abstracted from the heinousness of it by being kind of separated into this routine of daily life between these two people that's masqueraded as healing, that even Ernest Burkhart himself has to internalize as healing, even though he knows what he is doing is harming. There's a way that the film presents and then forces you to internalize what that is, what it means for this murder to be propagated on such a scale, but also how the act of it is internalized and rationalized, not just in terms of how America rationalizes the murder of its native citizens to itself, but also how individual human beings rationalize the doing of evil to people that they love as a part of that love. And that idea is so difficult, but the film does an amazing job of allowing you a space to kind of think about that and the monumental scale of that, because it's a very difficult subject matter to even comprehend. And the fact that it's so difficult to comprehend is where the film's dalliances with metafiction become prominent, in the sense that the scale and weight of the evil is so great that the film itself, by its conclusion, almost buckles under the weight of that. And the pretense of a fictionalization, the pretense that what we are watching is a fictionalization, is all but completely collapsed by the conclusion of the film. I mean, there's already the idea that this is a fictionalization. You know, you already get holes in that pretense with the presence of so many actual real Osage people who are in large part enacting and depicting experiences that their direct grandparents and great grandparents experienced. Sometimes the generational chain is even shorter than that. So already on the face of it, as you watch this film, and you are seeing these real Osage people, many of whom are not professional actors, presenting this fictionalized representation of what really happened, already the pretense of cinema begins to kind of buckle under that. But then by the end of the film, that is completely shredded away by its epilogue, and then spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, the cameo from the director himself to speak to the ultimate fate of the film's central character completely tears the fabric of the storytelling apart. You're no longer separated from it by the veil of fiction. You're confronting the reality of it in a way that is much more akin to a documentary. So the way that the film is obviously so lumbered by the weight and scale of the evil that it is depicting, the very true story that it is telling, such that the form itself is completely torn asunder by the end of the movie, I found to be really impactful and really affecting and really powerful as a way of telling the story and of coming to grips with and acknowledging the limits of the form in representing something so vast and unfathomable in its scale, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was the biggest aspect of Killers of the Flower Moon that struck me. It's yeah, I mean, I could call it a masterpiece. I could call it all of these things that would ultimately feel glib in the light of how I really feel about it. It's a special movie.
It's immensely moving just to see that happen, because Marty's always been preoccupied with distinctly American evils throughout his entire career, just like the greed naturally of that. And it's like that is obviously what lured him in to pursue telling this story. And it's very powerful to see, again, one of the living greatest storytellers of our time at the coda of the film essentially very bluntly just say, I probably shouldn't have been the one to tell this story, but I still felt like I had to. And that's a level of acknowledgement that I feel like is really rarely ever seen with art. And I just, again, that's the moment of the movie that really sticks with me, other than the final scene with DiCaprio and Gladstone. And I just want to say it is kind of getting lost in the shuffle just because it's a bit taken for granted, because, two of our greatest living actors, DiCaprio and De Niro, are great in this. I have also never, throughout watching all of the movies that these men are in, I have never hated these two as presences. Like, again, not like as performances. They're great performances, but like as people who embody the worst aspects of the mundanity of evil. There has not been a character in Robert De Niro's entire career which comprises mostly of him playing unlikable monsters, where he has played a more unlikable monster than here. And DiCaprio's just as bad. The entire time you're just like, I want to leap into the screen and shoot these people in the face, because it is agonizing to watch them march forward and just keep going. It's kind of the same feeling you get from any sort of great rise and fall story. Like it kind of feels like, this is such a glib comparison, but it's how I feel when I watch something like Breaking Bad from start to finish, where you become mired in how detestable the main character's actions are so thoroughly that you're just like, you're almost begging the story to stop, and it just doesn't. And that's the chokehold that this movie has on viewers that I feel like is really arresting. And it's very similar to Oppenheimer in that regard, honestly, where the latter half of the movie really just makes you, it goes further than just making you feel bad about a real life thing. It really just makes you like contemplate everything in a much grander scale. It's what cinema is for, frankly, and there's no better compliment I can give it than that.
Let us know at home what you think of any of the music or the film that we've discussed today, what you've been listening to, what you've been watching, what you want us to talk about, what's been on your mind. Let us know in the comments below, and let's continue the conversation. If you want to go above and beyond and support the channel directly for just $1 a month, you can become a member of the JMD family, get your name on the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about in one of our now episodes, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Avis, we try harder.